Good afternoon. Today's video is going to be the beginning of a short series that I'm going to do on deck building concepts for Lord of the Rings LCG. This series will be aimed at probably newer players who are working on building decks, but also for players who just like to talk about the game or maybe see philosophies on deck building from other players. So I'm going to talk about every hero that I've used in a deck so far. So far meaning up to the Intruders in Chetwood quest, which is the first quest of the Lost Realm expansion. So any hero that I've used up to that point I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to talk about why I included them in a deck and when I might include them in a future deck, what the challenges generally are in selecting heroes, and hopefully this will be entertaining and or useful to newer players or to experienced players who want a new philosophy on deck building or just want to relax for a bit maybe. So anyway, let's get started. Typically I've found that for quests, they fall into a couple of categories. Number one, and this is the most common one, the quest asks you to contribute willpower to it. That is the overwhelming majority of the quests in the game. You need willpower. Willpower allows you to add progress to the quest, and adding progress to the quest is usually a component of winning the game. These heroes in the upper left are heroes that were chosen specifically in a deck specifically for their ability to add willpower to the quest. Celeborn starts with 3. I'd prefer 4 to consider a hero really good at questing. I would like him to contribute 4 willpower per turn. However, he has only 3, but he does buff each Sylvan ally that enters play by 1 willpower per turn. And there's some Sylvans that are pretty good at questing. In particular, the Sylvan Refugee, which gives you 2 willpower for 1 cost, 3 willpower with Celeborn, and Galadriel's Handmaiden, which gives you 2 cost, 2 willpower, and 1 threat reduction, which is very good value. So Sylvans I find are among the synergies that have been released so far. I consider them the best at questing, and Celeborn and Galadriel work particularly well together because she allows allies you control to not exhaust to commit to the quest during the round they enter play. And she can contribute 4 willpower herself once she has Nenya on her. Eowyn just contributes 4 as a base value, and you can discard a card from hand to increase that by 1. These heroes were chosen for decks almost exclusively because of their ability to commit willpower to a quest. Now, the other type of challenge that's very common is some combination of willpower and combat. So I've noticed in the last couple of cycles especially, it's very, very common for a quest to ask you to add progress to it and then defeat a boss at the end. In some combination. Sometimes it's a boss at the beginning, sometimes in the middle. Then there are quests that are only combat, and all you need to do is defeat a boss or a series of bosses. A good example of that would be the 3 trials, or quests that are very heavy on battling, like the boss is the primary objective, and then you have to do a little questing after that, so that you have to do a lot of combat focus and a little willpower focus. It's rare now that you see a quest that's only willpower focused. It's rare that you see a quest that's only battle focused. Usually it's some combination of the two. And the challenge in deck building comes from choosing heroes that fit the specific challenges presented by the encounter deck. For example, sometimes when you're playing against a quest, it has a lot of enemies that are like 5 defense roughly, some combination of 2 shields and 3 health, for which Bjorn is extremely well suited because he does 5 attack and doesn't exhaust to defend, but often quests will throw a 6 defense enemy at you, some combination of 4 health and 2 shields, and then Bjorn alone can't handle it. And the objective or the challenge in deck building is then, how will I A, defend the attacks, B, deal enough damage to the enemies to kill them or keep them under control? Because it used to be, early in the game cycle, it was viable to build pure willpower focused decks and just basically ignore combat. That's kind of what I did for the entirety of the Hobbit series, was just build an astonishing speed Rohan deck and kind of just ignore everything on the board and blitz right through it. That's not as possible anymore, because the enemies have a variety of horrifying effects that they do when they attack you, which slow you down or halt your progress entirely. Their threat values are getting higher. So now usually you need decks with some combination of willpower and attack power. Now the last category that I'm going to talk about, it's not the last category period, but the last one that I'm going to talk about is specialty quests that are like siege or battle questing. Siege questing for newer players means instead of using willpower to add progress to a quest, you add shields. And battle questing means instead of using willpower to add progress to a quest, you use attack power. So Bjorn would not be a 0 contributor to a quest, and a battle quest, when you're facing a battle quest, he would contribute 5 progress. Very strong. So let's go over the heroes. I went over the willpower heroes. Each of these were chosen for their willpower, and it should be reasonably obvious why I think they are strong at contributing willpower. 4 is the highest willpower value in the game currently. Éowyn is extremely strong. Because of the requirement that most encounter decks have that you contribute some willpower to quests in order to clear it, Spirit is the sphere that does well with willpower. Leadership is kind of an all-rounder type of thing, but generally what they specialize in is collecting resources. And you also have, like, that's where your synergistic heroes are, who buff other allies. Celeborn, Dane, and so forth, they buff. Heroes that buff allies come from leadership. Heroes that generate resources come from leadership. Sometimes you get some sort of all-rounder heroes, like I would call Aragorn, kind of a hero that does a little bit of everything well. He's in leadership. Tactics is focused on battling. And lore is what I would call the utility class. Draws cards, heals, that sort of thing. And so it is very rare that I play a deck without any spirit cards. Spirit being the questing, the blue sphere, the questing sphere, because almost all quests require some willpower generation, and Spirit is the best at that, in my view. And so I almost always, going through my deck lists, I think there was maybe 1 or 2 of the 50 or so quests I've done so far that didn't include any Spirit hero. So first thing that I do when I'm analyzing a quest and thinking about building a deck is think which Spirit hero would fit this deck. Unless I already have a deck in mind that's synergistic and doesn't require Spirit, but that's been very rare. Typically, I'm thinking which Spirit hero is currently the best. And at this moment in time, I like Glorfindle the best for Spirit because of his low threat. But these are the strongest heroes that I have played. Not the strongest heroes, period, but the strongest heroes that I have played so far, who were played for their questing value. Now let's talk about these cards in the bottom right here. Sam, Glorfindle, and Merloned. They were chosen because of their low threat. You think of Glorfindle and you think he's a very powerful hero, but he would not be powerful at 9 or 10 threat. His 3 willpower, 3 attack, and 1 shields are good, but if he didn't, even if he didn't have this, when he exhausts to commit to a quest, raise your threat by 1, he would need an ability to be good if he was 3/3/1, 5 health, and he had 10 threat. He is good because of his low threat. And so when I'm going to choose a Spirit card, I typically look at Glorfindle first because of his low threat. And low threat is very powerful because it's dual usage. It allows you to build defensively because you can control when you engage enemies and how many enemies you engage. So I look to Glorfindle first, even though he's a little bit weaker in willpower than Éowyn or Galadriel, specifically because of his low threat, and I almost always like to build my decks with at least one low threat character, one low threat hero, because I like to start under 30 threat, because there are some quests where 30 threat is a threshold over which you engage nasty enemies very quickly. And if you start with at least one hero who's low threat, low meaning 5, 6, maybe 7, maybe 8, depending on the deck, that gives you options. And Glorfindle with his 5 starting threat gives you a lot of options. So when I'm choosing a spirit hero, I almost always look to Glorfindle first. I've been playing Galadriel lately because she combos well with Celeborn, but I don't consider her the strongest spirit hero, simply because of Glorfindle's low threat, and because all you have to sacrifice to get that low threat is 1 willpower, and I consider that an acceptable trade. Now, once I've gotten my spirit hero selected, then it depends on what the quest is asking of me. If the quest is asking of me to be good at battling, I look often to Bjorn. I've turned to him very often, because he's the highest attack power hero in the game at 5, and because he does not exhaust to defend, so he can often handle defending as well as battling, at least for a number of turns. Baragon is a hero that I choose for his defense value. Now, that is a challenge sometimes presented by quests when they have a high attack power attack coming every turn. Sometimes that's from a boss. Sometimes that's from a encounter deck that's heavy in enemies that are fairly high attack. The Warg quest comes to mind when you talk about Baragon. There's a few others, but he is a very strong defender because of his 4 shields, and because he can play Gondorian Shield on him for free, which brings him up to 6, which is enough to withstand an enemy attack every turn, pretty much. At least one enemy attack every turn without taking any damage. So that allows you to overcome the challenge of constant attacks. Usually, decks that do constant attacks on you, encounter decks, don't also require you to have a lot of willpower, but sometimes they do. Sometimes you'll take threat early because you failed questing, because Baragon has 0 willpower. So you do have to keep that in mind. You have to keep in mind the balance between how much defense you need, how much willpower, or how much willpower or attack power you need when it comes to Bjorn. But in any deck where I can get away with a 0 willpower champion, I'll consider Bjorn. Even though he has 12 threat, because he's just so good at combat. He's one of my favorite cards for that. Again, these are not what I consider the be-all and end-all of hero selection. This is simply my philosophy, one philosophy that has worked so far on the quests that I've played, and works in fairly short order in terms of constructing a deck to defeat specific challenges. So the top left, cards that are good at questing. Bottom left, cards that are good at battling or defending. That's why they were chosen. Cards in the bottom right, these cards were chosen. Now we have some more on the bottom left. Also cards that are either good at battling or defending. And let's go over those now before I go over the low threat cards. Frodo. Frodo allows you to defeat some unique challenges by converting damage into threat. I played him a lot before Baragon came out. I've kind of forgotten about him lately, but he's still very good. with 7 threat, he starts at a lower threat, and he allows you to convert damage into threat, and he was very useful in defeating challenges where you had a big attack coming every turn, but you started at relatively low threat. An excellent example of that would be the quest Shadow and Flame, because you start at 0 threat, and Frodo can tank the attack from the Balrog every single turn. Very strong defensive hero. Probably will be utilized more in the future. Typically my go-to for defending has been Baragon, because Frodo has the caveat that he does require you to start at relatively low threat. You can't really start at 30 and then convert a lot of attacks into threat with Frodo, or you're quickly going to be bumping into the threat ceiling, especially when encounter decks started throwing a lot of cards at you with Doomed, or encounter cards which would raise your threat. That made it less viable to use Frodo to cancel damage, and that's probably by design. So I haven't been turning to him as much for a defensive hero, but in the past that's why I included him as a defensive hero. Gimli was a choice of mine in the past for attack, because he could be buffed with +1 attack for each damage token on him, so he could go up to 5 without any additional cards on him, and with a Citadel plate you could boost him up to 4, 8, 10 or so, or even higher if you had multiple Citadel plates, so he was very strong for defeating high health enemies. I've gotten away from him some lately because I found it more effective when I need a single hero to have high attack to use Gondorian Fire, which adds a 1 attack power for each resource on a hero. And so I've used that in some quests like 3 Trials where I needed high attack power attacks. But that was why Gimli was chosen in the past, was for his combat ability, for his ability to get to high attack power and take down enemies in one swing that had a lot of HP or shields. Boromir was a hero chosen in the past for his battling capability primarily, because at the time, typically when a quest, probably the most common challenge that a quest will present is willpower and battling. It needs you to contribute willpower and some battling, with a little bit more emphasis on the willpower than the battling. And so probably my most common deck combination will be 2 heroes that are there for questing and 1 hero that's there for battling. And when it comes to battle questing or siege questing, that still applies. I want to do 2 heroes that are good at battle questing, and then 1 hero who's there for combat or there for utility or something like that. And Boromir at the time was the second strongest at battle questing in the game, because of his ability to quest and attack or defend in the same turn, because he can ready himself by using 1 threat once per phase. Before his errata he could do it infinitely, which is super OP. But even after his errata I still find him very strong for battle or siege questing, and will likely turn to him for that in the future should battle or siege questing come up again. It's a challenge that an encounter deck presented in a few quests presented it in the Heirs of Numenor era, but haven't seen it much since then. But I'll keep Boromir in mind, because the ability to both quest and attack or defend is very strong. And that's why he was included in the past and could potentially be included again in the future. Let's move on to the heroes that were chosen for low threat. There's not much to say about them. Merloned has only 5 threat when paired with 2 other lore heroes. She starts at 8, but each hero gets -1 with a printed lore resource, so effectively she's -5, or she's 5 threat. That's incredibly good. That's why she was chosen. She's not particularly strong in any other area, and there's not much else to say about her. Any situation where a monosphere lore deck can make sense, I'll use Merloned in the future. Sam doesn't seem like he's that low a threat with 8 threat, but that 8 is currently the lowest threat value in the leadership sphere. So he'll be chosen if I need a low threat leadership hero, and Theodred doesn't make sense, Theodred being the other 8 threat leadership hero. Theodred I like probably a little more than Sam because of Theodred's resource generation. But Sam is also a good option because of his 3 willpower, and Theodred only has 1. So Sam can fulfill that role. Merry and Pippin were both chosen to be in a Hobbit deck. I only played them in 1 quest. To be honest, I played them because they were new and I wanted to play them. I didn't find them particularly strong even though they have low threat. And the reason is because typically you only want 1 hero that's low threat. Because if you choose 3 that are low threat, they usually have a downside, and their downside is low stats, and that doesn't really work to have 3 heroes with low stats. You can get away with 1, but then you need the other 2 to bring some power, bring some thunder to the table. And Merry and Pippin don't really do that. At least not at this point. Maybe the synergy will be developed further later. I enjoyed playing them, but I didn't find them very powerful, and so I only played that combination for 1 quest, and it was only really because they were new and I wanted to try them. But I'm talking about every hero that I've played so far, and so I'm talking about the reasons why I played these heroes and when I might select them again in the future. And to be honest, I don't see myself selecting Merry and Pippin again in the future, because it's not very common that I need a low threat tactics hero. And when I need a low threat lore hero, I think I actually have chosen Pippin more than once to fill that role. Low threat lore hero. He's lower threat than Merloned if you're only playing 1 lore hero. So if I needed a hero from the lore sphere and I didn't have the low threat slot filled already, then I would choose Pippin. 2 things I always look for in a deck. Number 1, a spirit hero. Almost always, I should say. Number 1, a spirit hero, and number 2, a low threat hero. And I've used Glorfindle so often because he fulfills both those roles, but I consider those 2 roles very important enough that I've included those 2 roles, a hero that fits those 2 roles in almost every deck I've built. But not every deck, but almost every deck, I would say. In the upper right here, we have heroes that were included in decks because they combo in particularly powerful ways. Elrond combos with Vilya to get out resources very cheaply, to get out allies very cheaply, primarily. And Gandalf combos with Gandalf's staff and or wizard pipe in a number of interesting ways, which I've talked about before. But those 2 are not chosen because of their stats, although their stats are good, but they were chosen because of their comboing ability. They're 2 of my favorite heroes for that reason, because combo decks are very interesting to me. But they were not exceptional at questing. They're not exceptional at combat. They're definitely not low threat. They're chosen because of their combo utility value. And I would define Dane the same way. His stats are not particularly good, but his combo utility value is high because when he's ready to dwarf characters get +1 attack and +1 willpower. And so that's why Dane was chosen. I think his name might be pronounced Dane. I'm not sure. But that's why he was chosen for decks, is because of his comboing ability. However, I did find him slow in solo play because he can't quest very effectively himself. So you're basically starting with 2 heroes questing wise. And the dwarves are a little bit weak in the early game in questing. So I didn't find them particularly powerful, and I wasn't too sad to be moving away from them in solo play. But that's why Dane was included. Now, on to the second page. These heroes in the upper left, Aragorn, Grimo, Denethor, and Theodred, are all heroes that were chosen for their utility value. None of them have very good stats. Aragorn's probably the closest to having good stats. But Lore Aragorn has the ability to reduce threat to your starting threat level once per game. And just as importantly, you can play Sword That Was Broken on him, which gives all your characters +1 willpower. And that combo is very, very strong for questing. And that's why Lord Aragorn was chosen. Not because of his stats, but because his name is Aragorn. And his reduce your threat to your starting threat level is very useful. But primarily, he's chosen because his name is Aragorn. And that's why I've chosen Leadership Aragorn in the past too. Although in the core set I chose him because he was, in spite of the fact that he got outclassed by other heroes in questing ability and in attack power, he was very powerful in the core set, one of the most powerful heroes, and so I chose him there for that reason. And I have chosen him at different times after that, primarily for his utility value, that being I can play Sword that was broken on him, and or he comes from the leadership sphere. That's why he was chosen. Grimo was chosen because he's a lore hero, so he comboed with Merloned to come in at low threat, and for his ability to lower cost of your next card by 1. I do still think Grimo is pretty good. The caveat being that you need to build a deck for him because he needs low threat, due to the fact that his ability raises threat by 1 each time you use it. But he was chosen for his utility, and I would choose him again for his utility. Same as Lord Aragorn or Leadership Aragorn. They'll probably be chosen again. Aragorn because he's named Aragorn, and Grima because his utility value is pretty strong when you build around him. Denethor I think I played one time, specifically because I needed a hero that could have shields, and there were some, I think, particularly nasty encounter cards that I might have wanted to move to the bottom of the deck. I'm not really sure if I remember why I played Denethor, but that's what I think my reasoning was. Definitely a utility-focused hero. Not particularly strong stats, not good at questing, not a good battler, although he does have some defensive ability. But his utility is pretty, well, it's not my favorite. It doesn't feel particularly satisfying to me to play Denethor, although I'm sure there are plenty of players that would disagree. But I think I played him once and he was chosen for his utility. And Theodred is chosen for his low threat. Doesn't seem like 8 is low, but it's the lowest in the leadership sphere. And his ability to generate resources and to choose which hero the resource goes on. If he just generated it on himself, that wouldn't be that good, but the ability to generate resources on any hero of your choosing is still quite strong, even at this point in the game cycle. This hero being out for quite a while from the core set. But his ability to generate resources on specific heroes is quite strong. And likely he will be chosen again for that purpose. And also he's Rohan, which was helpful in the deck where I played Astonishing Speed. So I've chosen him reasonably often, both for his low threat from the leadership sphere and for his resource generating capabilities. Now, in the bottom left are heroes that were chosen simply because I needed a hero from that sphere, and they were the strongest hero from that sphere available at that time. Glorfindle and Baragon were chosen for one quest because I needed 2 lore heroes in order to generate lore resources in order to play Lore of Imaldris, the healing card to defeat Journey to Rosgobel. And they were, in my opinion, the 2 strongest lore heroes available at the time, and so I picked them. Dwalin, because he's a dwarf that gave me access, and I wanted to play a dwarf deck, and he gave me access to the Spirit Sphere. That being one of the 2 requirements that I mentioned that I look for in almost every deck, a low threat hero and a spirit hero. And I was playing dwarves, and I needed a spirit hero, and Dwalin was the best dwarf spirit hero available at the time. And the same with Nori. Nori outclasses Dwalin in my opinion, because his ability is useful more often, and he, at the time that I played him, was the best available spirit dwarf hero. And Bifur, same reason. I wanted a dwarf hero from the lore sphere, and he was it. That's the only reason I played him, because he's got the dwarf tag and he's from the lore sphere. And Bilbo. I just played him because he was new. That's it. He was new. I wanted to play him because I like new cards. So I stuck him in there. Kind of had to work around his low health at times. May have even lost a game or two because of it. I just wanted to play him because he was new. Haven't really played him since then. So that covers every hero that I've played so far and my reasoning behind playing heroes. The guidelines going forward, you can't go wrong, in my opinion, with every deck thinking, okay, who am I going to play for my low threat hero slot? Who am I going to play for my spirit slot? Assuming you're not playing against a deck that requires only combat. Or requires, I don't know, there may be challenges in the future that use other things entirely. But if you can, now there'll be sometimes when you can't because combat takes precedence over low threat and you can get away with with higher threat starting, or because questing takes precedence over low threat and you can get away with higher threat starting in the deck. So sometimes you're gonna make exceptions, and you may even make exceptions frequently. Like the Beorn, Celeborn, Galadriel, Sylvan deck doesn't have a low threat hero slot. But it's very rare that you'll see a deck that I play without either of those two. I think every single deck I've played has had a hero in one of those two slots, low threat and or a spirit hero, and usually or often both. Once you've got those figured out, then you need to figure out whether the deck requires combat or not, and if it does, how you're going to handle the combat. You can handle it with something like Dane and the dwarf and his dwarf friends and his dwarf buff. But typically I'll like to include a combat hero. If an encounter deck requires me to defeat a boss or has enemies that are difficult to ignore because of their threat values, I'll like to include Beorn. Sometimes I'll include specific concepts designed to deal with enemies like ranger bows to shoot at the staging area is a good example. The Hobbit deck I think tried to avoid combat entirely by staying at low threat. The Rohan deck tried to just run by every enemy by questing so fast. But typically, once I've got the low threat and the spirit hero decided on, I'll then look to combat. Who am I going to have handle combat? And then once that's done, typically I will, for the third hero, I will just add another hero that's good at questing, or a hero that combos with the ones that I already have. So for example, if I was building a Sylvan deck and I wanted to use Celeborn and Galadriel, well, that covers my questing, my spirit. I probably either then I'm looking for a hero to fulfill the low threat spot, or I'm looking for a combat hero. And if I'm looking for a combat hero, it's typically Beorn. If I'm looking for a low questing or a low threat hero, it's typically Glorfindel. And then I'll build my deck, the allies, the attachments, the events around the heroes that I've chosen. Sometimes I'll choose a hero specifically because their sphere allows me to play an ally or an attachment that I consider important or necessary to defeat a quest. But usually I choose the heroes first and then choose the cards from their sphere around them. And then I'll try it out, and if it doesn't work, I'll determine why it didn't work, which concept might be better at it. Typically, if the Willpower Combat type of deck doesn't work, then I'll turn to a combo deck to try next. And my favorite ones right now are Elrond Villia and or Gandalf. And if that doesn't work, then I'll see perhaps what's worked for other players, and if somebody had an idea that I liked. Or sometimes I'll just try random stuff and see if anything works until I get an inspiration for building something. But if I were a newer player and looking for tips, the main ones are take care of your questing first. Who are you going to pick from the Spirit Sphere would be a way to think about that. If the encounter deck requires questing at all, how am I going to take care of the questing? That's what I look at first. Then after that, how am I going to take care of the combat? And then after that, who works well with the heroes that I've already got? Usually at that point, it'll be pretty straightforward. You'll be like, okay, well, I've got, say, Eowyn and Bjorn. That handles, well, now I need a low threat hero if I can. So I'll throw Glorfindle in there with them. Or maybe I need a low threat hero, but I want access to leadership. So I'll turn to either Glorfindle with Song of Kings or something like that. You know, that's how, because usually that's the third requirement that I would look at for deck building. I haven't talked about this yet because it's not specific to heroes, which is resource generation. I don't think I've ever built a deck that doesn't have Steward of Gondor in it, or maybe one, but it's super rare. But that covers the resource generation. And so if you don't have a leadership hero in your deck, you have to play Song of Kings or some other way to get Steward of Gondor out on the table. So those are the requirements or the things that I think about. A, Spirit Hero or questing. B, a low threat hero to give me options for defense. C, battle questing. D, resource generation, which means someone from the leadership sphere or Song of Kings. I think every single one of my decks has fulfilled those criteria, except for the Hobbit deck, which I played for fun, but didn't think was particularly powerful. So my thoughts may have been a little jumbled on this, I'm not sure. But hopefully this will be useful to newer players and perhaps returning players who are interested in thinking about the game or thinking about another deck building philosophy aside from their own. That's how I build my decks. I wouldn't say it's the best way, but it's the way that has worked for me so far. So, thanks for watching.